Listen up, get ready, I'm not gonna take no more. There's a revolution, a revelation going on in my soul. Buckle up, get ready, we're not gonna say.
Hey, we're back with more live from the Heartland for the week of January 28th. We are recording this on the 25th. And now we're going to go to our on-the-spot guy, Brian Mier, who was down in Brazil for many, many, many years, works as a reporter, and has blessed us with his presence on the Live from the Heartland show a number of times. As many of you regular listeners know, we've been following what goes on in Brazil, and we've been gearing up for the election. The election is over. Lula has been reelected. He's been out of office for 12 years. There's a lot of hope on the part of a lot of progressives around the world. Let's find out what's been going on. Hi, Brian. How are you doing today?
Pretty good. I'm okay. Thanks for having me.
Give us a little rundown. The most recent thing that happened down there after the election was there was a lot of apprehension about a reaction from the Bolsonaro people. They were camped out at military headquarters. And then next thing you know, there's an attack on the Capitol. It's just like it was January 8th, but it could have been 2 years earlier on January 6th in Washington. Fill us in on what's going on, brother.
Okay, well, first of all, there's a lot of similarities, but there's also some major differences, right? Like what happened on January 6th. Remembering that Jair Bolsonaro's son, Congressman Eduardo, took part in the January 5th War Council meeting in Washington, D.C. with Mike Lindell and Sidney Powell and all those other people. They have very, very close ties with Bannon and the Trump people. And those are the people who are giving them advice on how to do things, right? A lot of advice on big data targeting on social media and things like that, and tactics, white supremacist dog whistles and things like that. And so they were too weak in Brazil, however, to try to pull this off on Inauguration Day, like they did on January 6th in the United States. On Inauguration Day, 300,000 people came out to see Lula's inauguration. And another big difference is that Bolsonaro fled the country before finishing his term. A couple days before the end of the term, he didn't do the right bureaucracy to transfer power, and he just flew up to Orlando. Since he hadn't transferred power, he still had his diplomatic visa. So he's up there now, and the US government has told him he has 30 days to change his status. And a lot of progressive members of Congress are trying to pressure the Biden administration to not give him the visa, right? So they waited until a week after the inauguration on a Sunday in which the entire downtown area of the city was completely empty. It's vacation month in Brazil too this month, so totally empty. And so they stormed some empty government buildings. Unlike January 6th when Congress was in session, people were apparently trying to even hang Nancy Pelosi or something. These were empty buildings, but the difference was, one thing that was similar is that in both cases, it looked like a lot of the police officers were just opening the doors for them. You know, like in the presidential palace, all these windows were broken, but there was no damage to the front door at all, right? Which is highly suspicious. And since like 30% of the people who came, it was only about 10,000 people, they're like streamers, they're all streaming live. All of a sudden, everyone had footage of everyone who was there. They had footage of all these police officers like hugging them and taking selfies with them, military police. And so there was a lot of complacency from the military police and also from the actual military. Some factions within the military seemed like they were on board with trying to implement an actual military coup that day. And what happened was, after the person in charge of the military police that day in Brasilia was Bolsonaro's former national security chief, who had been appointed to be Brazilia's security chief on January 2nd. He immediately also flew to Orlando to meet with Bolsonaro. So he was up in Orlando, and then the governor was like, okay, he's fired. He shouldn't have done that. But the governor is a strong ally of Bolsonaro too. And so the governor said, well, I fired our security advisor. It looks like there was some complacency with the military police, but now I've got everything under control. I'm going to take care of it. And so the police started doing this kind of like turtle game where they were like launching tear gas where there weren't any people, like marching together, but not arresting anybody. And after a couple hours of this, Lula, who was out of town visiting a disaster zone, he just issued this decree. Starting right now, the governor is, removed from office for 90 days, and the federal government's taken over the security. And within 20 minutes, they'd cleared all of the buildings because most of the people there were over the age of 40, and many of them were in their 50s and 60s. They were infiltrated with people who knew exactly what they were doing. I mean, they stole all of the guns from the intelligence bureau. So there were people, I mean, it was planned and everything, but it's mostly an older crowd. So this just showed that if the police had been doing their job, everything would have been finished. They would have never gotten into any of the buildings. So in the weeks that followed, there's been all this information uncovered about certain members of the military going up to very high ranks who are actually interested in pulling off this coup. And so
didn't Lula fire the head of the military, or is that the guy you referenced already?
The head of the army. Exactly.
Army.
So, I mean, the head of defense is a conservative. And Lula got a lot of flack for appointing a conservative as defense minister in the first week of January. But what you have to understand is the army, the military, was never cleaned up after the dictatorship. Everyone got amnesty. And a lot of the people in the Bolsonaro government were major players during the dictatorship. They all hate Lula's guts because he's one of the main people who brought down the dictatorship, right? And Lula doesn't get along with them at all. He was arrested during the dictatorship. They tortured his brother with electric shock for 15 days during the dictatorship. So there's a lot of bad blood. He decided to nominate a conservative because there's two factions in the military going back to the dictatorship era. They're the regular conservative military who believe in the rule of law. And there's this group called the Tigers, who are just far right fascist reactionaries, right? And so Bolsonaro had put all of these Tigers up into high positions, and Lula's now purging the military of them and handing the military back over to the regular conservatives. It's not ideal at all, right? But it's a lot better than the alternative. And so now what he was initially getting a lot of flack for is turning out to prove to be like a master stroke of political cunning, because the guy he put in power has enough clout, to take care of it, to fire people. They respect him enough. Minister Murcio, so they fired hundreds of members of the military, going all the way up to the level of general. And basically, the government is moving forwards very well in a lot of fronts. Unfortunately, they've uncovered a genocide underway in the Yanomami indigenous reservation in Roraima state, which Bolsonaro had opened up for illegal gold miners to enter and log and mine and things like that. And they poisoned all the rivers with mercury. It's a disaster zone there. 570 children have died from mercury poison and starvation. And it's just really exposed how ruthless and how horrible the Bolsonaro government really was. And he's becoming more and more isolated over this.
I want to follow up on the rainforest in general, but first I want to ask you a question about, you mentioned kind of the principles of the right wing there, the Bolsonaro people, and I think you said, I don't know if you used the term white supremacy, but I wondered, in Brazil, so much of Brazil was shaped by me watching that movie.
Which one?
Orpheus Descending kind of thing.
Oh, Black Orpheus.
Black Orpheus.
It's a classic.
And it's a beautiful movie, but it just, Brazil has a sizable non-white population. I'm just wondering, is it really the non-white division, or there's a crossover on both sides?
Yeah, Brazil is 53% Black, and sizable indigenous population mixed in with people Black and white descent and everything. But it has a large white population, a large white elite that's been running things since the 1500s or whatever. I mean, their definition of Black and white is different from the United States. Just like every other country, it's a totally arbitrary category. So for example, you could have a Afro-Brazilian grandparent and be white in Brazil. So it's not exactly the same. Nevertheless, there's huge population of Italian immigrants as well, German immigrants, Portuguese immigrants, and there there are parts of Brazil, even where they still speak German, and things like that. So and Italian, and so I mean, there's sambas that have been written in Italian. So there is a large white population, but white supremacy, it's a kind of virus, and it even infects people sometimes who might not look like they're white, who like they say Hitler was part Jewish and everything too, right? So, but unfortunately, white supremacy is very strong. Bolsonaro has a lot of ties to neo-Nazi organizations. There's a huge Nazi problem in Brazil that's growing, since Bolsonaro. Technically, it's illegal in Brazil to belong to a Nazi organization or be a Nazi or espouse Nazi ideals. But Bolsonaro relaxed all of the enforcement of all of that. And there's actually letters they've uncovered that he wrote to neo-Nazi websites about 20 years ago saying, you guys are the reason I'm in politics. And he really believes in a lot of, these kinds of ideals, especially if you see his treatment towards the indigenous people.
Well, Brian, when we were talking about, the poisoning of the rivers, et cetera, one of the things that we try to follow on the show and as political people, just in general, is what's going on with biodiversity and the planet. And can you give us a little more on the hopes we have under LULA for the rainforest there, as well as other things that people who were supporters of LULA are hoping will happen?
Well, the Workers' Party was running the country for 13 years, from 2003 to 2000 and the beginning of 2016. They were the world leader in greenhouse gas reduction, and a lot of that was by curtailing, significantly reducing deforestation, but also it had to do with investments in wind energy and solar energy and things like that. Around 20% of the remaining virgin Amazon rainforest is on indigenous land, right? And he has and there's still remote tribes that have very little contact with the outside world, like the Yanomami before 2 years ago. He's just turned over all of the government ministries and secretariats that have anything to do with indigenous people to members of indigenous tribal leadership who live on indigenous lands. So including Sonia Guajajara, who's the head of the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. This is the first time in history of Brazil that this has ever happened. And he's got a historic, do you remember Chico Mendes in the 1980s, who was assassinated? He was a rubber tapper union leader.
Yeah, I do remember that.
So his number two, Marina Silva, she was formerly Lula's environmental minister. They had a falling out. She kind of swung to the right for a while, but she's still a major worldwide figure in the environmental movement. I mean, she grew up in the rainforest and only learned how to read when she was 19. She's from a really poor family, and she's now the Minister of the Environment. And that's being, applauded around the world. So there's still a lot of problems. A lot of the Amazon region is just lawless, hard to control because it's a huge area of territory. The Amazon jungle is bigger than the continental United States, right? And so with only about 20 million residents, there's a lot of challenges and stuff, and we're worried that there could come some kind of tipping point where these fires start, like it's what's happened on the west coast of the US and in Australia and stuff. If people don't start acting really fast, I personally think they have to start doing a lot of replanting as well, to recuperate what's been burnt down in the last 4 years and, during the last, 100 years. Remembering there was the World Bank that convinced the military dictatorship in the 1970s that it would be good for Brazil's economy to rip down the rainforest, and they started financing it. And it's mostly American and European corporations that make money off of the deforestation. Cargill is one of the big ones. I think that people who want to help preserve the rainforest in the US, instead of donating to NGOs that in Brazil or something like that, should look into what kind of political strategies could be built to punish American companies and American businessmen who are selling, lumber from Brazil, the U.S. is still one of the big buyers of Amazonian lumber on the black market. And the people like groups like Cargill that are producing soy inside of the legal Amazon, encouraging soy production by building these huge river ports in places completely surrounded by jungle, knowing that this will encourage people to burn down jungle, so their soy can reach the ports. And the beef industry, is another big. During the 80s, the biggest purchaser of beef produced in the Amazon rainforest was Burger King, right? I mean, now everything's done indirectly. No one wants to say their beef comes from the Amazon rainforest now, but I would be willing to bet that a large percentage of the beef consumed in the U.S. still comes from the legal Amazon.
Well, this has been great, and we have a packed house today with our show. One last thing, I just wanted to ask you, since I hadn't remembered the name of the film Black Orpheus, but thank you for reminding. I love that film. Another film I saw that I don't know if you've ever saw was called The Emerald Forest. Did you ever see that?
Yeah, that's a classic too.
That's a good one. It's where a white kid gets kidnapped by some native people and they take him into the jungle and he becomes an advocate and goes up against his dad who is trying to build a dam. I won't go any further.
I'd like to recommend a recent movie that I think is the best anti-imperialist movie made in any language in the last 20 years, which is called Bacurau. It's incredible. Look for it, watch it. I'm sure you'll like it.
Where does it take place? Just give us a hint.
It's in the desert-like backlands of the Northeast. It's about a group of foreigners, mostly Americans, in a hunting club. It takes place in a parallel near future, and they're coming there to hunt people.
Oh gosh. Okay. Well, that's
people rise against them. It's really good. It's really good.
Brian Mier, it's really good to have you on, and I can't wait till I get to Brazil and hang out with you down there, or if you're back up here. And we'll check in with you a few weeks, maybe a month, but get another report because they're really good.
Right. Thanks a lot, Michael.
Keep up the good work, brother.
Say hi to Katie for me, okay?
I will do that. She's working hard on a political campaign.